100 years ago, Oxford was convulsed by debates over a proposed new university building. It would, claimed some, destroy a much-loved view. It was, alleged others, not just bad in its own right, but positively damaging to the city as a whole. To put it up, declared Bodley's librarian, no less, to put it up would be little short of an aesthetic crime. Still more scandalously, the city council was believed to be conniving in this architectural abomination, jobbing it through the planning process in a series of dubious meetings. To the critics' despair, this hated building was eventually erected. And what was it? Well, it was this: the Bridge of Sighs, a structure that must be one of the most photographed in the whole of Oxford, a building so beloved that Hertford hosted an event a few years ago to celebrate its centenary. The aesthetic crime of 1913 is in 2020 one of Oxford's most familiar and most photographed sites, even if it does obscure a really very nice view of New College Tower. Now, it would be gratifying to be able to argue that the story of the Bridge of Sighs has a simple moral, that any building, however controversial, will, with time, become accepted, even loved. But of course, that just isn't true. Take this building, for instance, the modern warden's lodgings at Merton, for example. Little liked when it was first built, by the time Bill Bryson encountered this in the early 1990s, he was just one of many who was appalled by what he described as, and I quote, a little dash of mindless 60s excrescence foisted on an otherwise largely flawless street. And he envisaged the meeting of the fellows at Merton where they said, well, we've only built beautiful buildings for the last 700 years. Why don't we build something really hideous instead? So ashamed was Merton of this criticism that the college took the whole building and had it refaced, disguising the original facade behind a new front that was officially reopened by Bill Bryson. Here, in other words, is the case of a building that only became more hated with time. Length of existence isn't enough to make people love it. The truth is that there is a very long history of architectural controversy in Oxford. In 1440, for instance, a new mason was employed to complete the half-finished divinity school. Dissatisfied with the existing work, the university authorities instructed Thomas Elkin to hold back in future from the superfluous and frivolous curiosity which had disfigured the project thus far. The north walls of the Divinity School still show the sudden abandonment of one plan in place of another, as you can see. What should have been this becomes that. The succeeding centuries would witness many similar changes of taste and style. In 1669, Wren's triumph over what was called the Gothic Rage was celebrated at the opening of the Sheldonian Theatre. Nearly 70 years later, in 1736, however, the properly Palladian Sir Nathaniel Lloyd celebrated the end of the Baroque era that the Sheldonian had inaugurated, thrilled there would be no more buildings in Oxford like Wren's, or like William Townsend's Queen's College, or Nicholas Hawksmoor's All Souls. Hawksmooring and Townsending, Lloyd wrote, is all out for this century. Less than a year after that, of course, James Gibbs began his magnificently Baroque Radcliffe camera. It was the Victorian era that saw many of the most violent battles about buildings. The University Museum, for instance, condemned as a cockatrice's den by one suspicious don, was attacked for its function as much as its form. Keble, by contrast, was widely hated for its use of polychromatic bricks. By the start of the 20th century, as the art historian Kenneth Clark recalled, it was, and he writes, universally believed that Keble was the ugliest building in the world. Undergraduates and young dons used to break off their afternoon walks in order to have a good laugh at the quadrangle. were still at neighbouring St John's, at my college, the Destroy Keble Society was founded, which you joined by removing one of the bricks. If you got one of the red bricks, it was a year. If it was one of the white bricks, membership for 10 years, and one of the sort of rarer, darker blue bricks was life membership. For John Ruskin in particular, these changes became unbearable. The Slade Professor of Art from 1870, his passage through Oxford grew ever more difficult with each succeeding year. He couldn't bear to walk near Keble or the University Museum, seeing both as abominations, a conclusion made all the more painful by his involvement in the design of the museum. He refused to go anywhere near the newly built examination schools, which he condemned as, and I quote, rooms for the torture and shame of scholars, built, again I quote, in a style as inherently corrupt as it is un-English. Ruskin loathed the Ashmolean and was forced to abandon his trips to Port Meadow. The mere threat of seeing Jericho was enough to spoil Port Meadow for him. For that reason, I think he would have been a tremendous supporter of Castle Mill, because, of course, you can't see Jericho past it. Given the range of buildings he sought to avoid, it's hard to imagine how Ruskin actually made it through the city. By 1884, he had had enough, mourning that, and I quote, every beautiful view, either of Oxford or from Oxford, is now scarified and blasted. A year later, in 1885, Ruskin resigned the chair, left Oxford, never to return. It was in this Ruskinian mode that Bodley's librarian, the overtly Ruskinian E.W.B. Nicholson, attacked the proposed Bridge of Sighs. Indeed, in his pamphlet of 1910, Can We Not Save Oxford's Architecture, Nicholson went further still, denouncing almost all buildings of the last two generations. No money, he maintained, no money can ever compensate for the ungraceful Radcliffe Science Library. The only reason, he goes on to say, that he had not opposed his erection more firmly was for the fear of what seeing the plans for it would do to Ruskin's fragile health. For Nicholson, the problems did not end there. The Taylorian, the Ashmolean, the Indian Institute on Broad Street, the external staircase to the Radcliffe Camera, newly built, all of these stood condemned. And as for the recently built accommodation for the Warden of Merton, because there's another Warden's lodgings that everyone's always hated at Merton, this was, he wrote, a monument of incanicity. It was, he wrote, debased and thoroughly out of keeping with the college and the street. Unfortunately, he concluded, we in England can hope nothing from earthquakes, but perhaps the bombs of a hostile yet discriminating aviator may someday bring relief. That these lodgings here in Merton Street would be succeeded by the building that Bill Bryson so deprecated might be seen as merely unfortunate. That another set of lodgings for the Warden of Merton, built in between the two, was described, condemned by its inhabitant as Agamemnon's tomb, could simply suggest that Merton has been particularly unlucky in its choice of 20th century architects. But of course, Merton is just one example amongst many. Another can be found nearby. Long neglected by historians and by visitors, but now with very much a place in the spotlight, the Rhodes Building at Oriel has been the subject to much attention, almost all of it, in fact, pretty much all of it negative in the last few years, and one can see why. It is the most naked celebration of a single imperialist in Oxford, far more so even than Rhodes House. Rhodes' statue, small though it is, looms above passers-by and even among monarchs. This doesn't seem to have been seen as shocking at the time, but it should have done. Founders and funders belong below kings, as at Wadham, where Nicholas and Dorothy Wadham are beneath James I. At Oriel, in first quad, it's the Blessed Virgin Mary who is above the kings. And I've often wondered, it has to be said aside, whether this isn't some tremendous joke on the Rhodes Building in which the unmarried Rhodes takes the place of the Virgin Mary in the north-facing part of Oriel. What appalled commentators and contemporaries, indeed commentators for most of the 20th century, however, was not this statuary, not this imperialist symbolism. That's very new. Rather, what appalled them was the architecture. Evelyn Waugh suggested that this was a building so ugly it should simply be dynamited. W.J. Arkell, a discriminating historian of Oxford, and in an interesting colonial manner expressed his disappointment that the whole thing hadn't been built in anything more durable than mud bricks. But again, this was a more general comment. This wasn't just about Rhodes and it wasn't just about Oriel. Evelyn Waugh, who was hardly woke, was not prompted by anti-colonial animus. No, he also wanted to demolish the Indian Institute, the town hall, the whole of Hertford, which had of course been his college, and much more besides. So what these objections reveal, like the objections to successive buildings at Merton, is not a series, I think, of little local difficulties, or at any rate, not little institutional difficulties. They expose, in fact, a far more general problem. Oxford has always been celebrated as a uniquely beautiful place. It has also been the location for some genuinely important, internationally important and innovative architecture, from the radical classicism of the Sheldonian to the defiant Gothicism of the University Museum. Both buildings are not merely stylistically important either. They also broke new ground in engineering. The metalwork at the University Museum was utterly unprecedented. Wren's plans for the roof of the Sheldonian were so remarkable that they were exhibited at the Royal Society, as indeed were the small round windows in the lunettes on the ground floor, which were designed to pivot to let in air and can thus be seen as a very early form of passive house, if you like, or certainly passive air cooling. Yet the question of how to integrate new buildings within the fabric of a city which everyone agrees is uniquely beautiful has never been completely resolved. And the changing tastes of each generation made building in Oxford an enterprise always freighted with controversy. And of course, the question of what will be sacrificed in order to enable development, or indeed to forestall it, is another question that provokes fierce debate. And so, as a test case to explore not a series of individual projects, but a bigger question, a question about the whole of Oxford, and a question about how to improve the amenities of Oxford, whilst also preserving the beauties of Oxford. In order to explore that as a whole, I want to look not at individual building projects. I want to look at something that wasn't strictly architectural. I want to look at a project that was never undertaken, much less completed, and yet a project that can, I believe, tell us a tremendous amount. And it was here that that project found its biggest fulfillment, or at least most heated set of debates, here in Christchurch Meadow. What I want to focus on, of course, is the mid-20th century battle over Oxford's roads, a battle that was to last for more than 30 years, a battle in some respects which has never been wholly resolved. So many plans were produced from the 1940s onwards and ultimately rejected right up until the 1970s, but quite early on in that debate, the Sunday Times was moved to describe Oxford as the home of lost causeways. So complex were the politics involved that in 1977 a whole doctoral thesis was written on the subject. And the fight over a road through Christchurch Meadow was not just long running, it was also unusually intense. In Oxford, wrote Hugh Trevor Roper, the Regius Professor of History, or just about to become Regius Professor of History in August 1955, in Oxford he wrote, "All intellectual speculation has given way to the great question of the road through Christchurch Meadow, which has totally convulsed city and university alike, rendering all old politics useless and all pretence of scholarship irrelevant. The road was debated in the press and on radio, in Parliament, and even in the Cabinet. Strikingly, the Prime Minister, Sir Anthony Eden, intervened personally in the dispute, breaking off from important meetings about the Suez crisis to arrange for what he obviously saw as equally important meetings between interested parties. And then, even as the Israelis mobilized to invade the Sinai, Eden wrote a 2-page letter to the Dean of Christ Church, setting out his own opinions on the matter. And little wonder that he felt that he had to when he was receiving letters like those dispatched by Lord Conisford, a former cabinet colleague. Conisford wrote to Eden, "If the road is constructed, then whatever you accomplish as Prime Minister, and your accomplishments will, I hope, be great, your government will be remembered amongst the vandals of history." I suppose good for Eden that he didn't get to build the road, and so he's now remembered for the Suez crisis instead. Now, this debate was not just about Oxford. Not least of the reasons for all this attention was the fact that this was a debate about traffic. For as historians like Simon Gunn have shown in a series of really important articles, the problem of traffic was a matter of immediate interest to mid-20th century Britons. The number of cars on British roads rose from 3 million in 1939 to more than 10 million in 1960. It was generally accepted by contemporaries, and you see this everywhere, that they were living through what was called the motor age, and that this would radically transform life and the towns in which people lived. Yet, of course, this raised huge questions for those places which wished to solve the traffic problem without damaging the built environment. In that sense, the question of traffic in the mid-20th century, and to a degree now, brought together 3 issues. The question of modernity, the motor age, of what the modern age would be, the issue of history and of preservationism, and the question of how to reconcile history and modernity with a sense of what it was to be British. As the Buchanan Committee, set up by the Ministry of Transport in 1960 to explore traffic in towns, put it, and I quote, "Our British cities are packed not only with buildings, they are also packed with history, and to drive motorways through them on the American scale would inevitably destroy much of what ought to be preserved." Now, this general problem, which was felt throughout the whole of Britain, found a particular purchase in Oxford. I love the fact that the bust there says relief. It was not just that the city was a magnet for cars, though of course it was. We all know Oxford forms a crossroad for traffic travelling from Birmingham to London and from East Midlands, from Wales to the south and the southeast. I mean, that's what it's always been for. That's why Oxford is here. It was this role as a crossroads for traffic that led the Times to dub Oxford the Clapham Junction of the road. And Oxford, as you know, was a motor town itself. Morris Motors in the 1950s made 1/4 of all cars in the country, and it literally transformed the city as a result, producing a wholly unanticipated and wholly unplanned new urban form. What it did, of course, was to divide Oxford in 2, between Cowley, where the car plant and most of its workers were based, and the ancient city itself, which from the 1930s onwards begins to be described as the Latin Quarter of Cowley. Yet if the majority of people were in Cowley, then the services, shops and facilities they wanted remained in the older part of town. The traffic which ensued was notorious, with a census in 1954 showing that each day more than 40,000 vehicles crossed Magdalen Bridge, which was at that point the only bridge, into the city centre. They then travelled down High Street, a street, as the Birmingham Post put it, that is one of the most famous and beautiful in Europe. And that only made matters worse, and of course is Carfax. Commentators in the 50s were as one in seeing this as a tragedy for Oxford and a test case for Britain's response to the motor age. For the planner, Colin Buchanan, traffic was, and I quote, "threatening to break down the entire organisation of Oxford as a centre for civilised life." For the editor of the Oxford Mail, Oxford had become a, and I quote again, "subtopian tragedy, which points to a lesson for every busy town in the country. Oxford," he concluded, "has become the classic example of a city," and this is a fabulous phrase, "a city in the culminating paroxysm of motorised thrombosis, Country Life put it more succinctly, observing that the Oxford traffic crisis is a matter of national concern, and this in July 1955. Thus, when Oxford City Council decided in 1945 to employ the distinguished planner Thomas Sharp to consider the town's future, it was inevitable that he should focus on traffic as well as other wider questions of development. Indeed, by hiring Sharp, whose career would be defined, as one writer puts it, by the problem of managing the massive growth of motor traffic in existing settlements, Oxford, by employing Sharp, had practically guaranteed that new roads would be a central part of his proposals. Oxford Replanned, which was a massive bestseller when it was published in 1948, in fact, went much further than people expected and went much further than just suggesting new transport facilities. Oxford Replanned laid out an ambitious programme of comprehensive urban redevelopment. But Sharp also addressed the issue of central Oxford's problems with cars and lorries more directly, proposing a new road immediately to the south of the city, running through the meadow, which of course abutted Christchurch. This new road, which Sharp christened Merton Mall in honour of the oldest of the Oxford colleges, was designed to take traffic away from the congested and blighted High Street, the street he described as, and I quote, and this is in Oxford Replanned, he described the High Street as the greatest and most typical work of art that England possesses. And here is the High Street, and here is Merton Mall, which, as you see, runs just to the south of the Meadow building and the other side of the Merton playing field from the college. It smashes through the meadow and comes here just south of the plain, and in destroying a small bit of the Magdalen College School and a little bit of St Hilda's, I think. Such a plan was typical of Sharp, and these plans, in fact, you can buy on mugs in the Bodleian at the moment, who almost always argued for these sorts of what Sharp called substitute roads, designed to relieve major thoroughfares by drawing off all traffic which did not absolutely need to be on them. The idea being that only those who needed to go into town would go across the High Street. Everyone else would be redirected through and out beyond. Sharp's plan also was distinguished from two earlier proposals that had been made to solve the problem of central Oxford. One as early as 1941 by the local architect Lawrence Dale, the other produced a few years later in 44-45 by the City Council itself. Dale had proposed something he called Christchurch Mall, a relief road or bypass of the sort that Sharp thought wholly inefficacious, running to the south of Christchurch Meadow and thus avoiding the destruction of a local amenity. The City Council was even less invasive of this amenity. They proposed a road well out of sight of Christchurch Meadow. Sharp looked at both plans, but he believed that both were insufficiently radical. Merton Mall, by contrast, his plan, number one on this, his description, Merton Mall would run only a few yards from the colleges, separating Christchurch from its meadow. This was, Sharp admitted, a loss of what he described as one of the pleasantest features of Oxford. But he concluded, and I quote, "In face of difficulties like those in Oxford, some sacrifice must be made somewhere. It is a question of whether High Street shall continue in madder and more murderous congestion, or whether the deep peace of one particular spot out of many such spots shall remain." This solution seemed so obvious to Sharp that he confessed himself to understand why it hadn't been proposed before. Perhaps, he conjectured in his report, fear of powerful anger has intimidated anyone who has thought of it. Well, he was quite right, of course. Each of the three proposals made in the 1940s had their supporters who would advocate them steadfastly for the next 3 decades. Each also had their opponents, and none more so, in fact, than Sharp's plan to build Merton Mall. So contentious was the subject that the City Council simply refused to make a decision. Compelled by the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act to produce a local development plan, it did so, but its draft ignored the problem of traffic entirely. It simply refused to make a decision. It was at this point that national government, in the shape of Duncan Sandys, Secretary of State for Housing and Local Government, intervened. Eton and Oxford educated, with a good war behind him, and as Churchill's son-in-law superbly well connected, Sandys was a dynamic minister determined to make his mark. In the words of one admiring colleague, he was, and I quote, a steamroller. He would grind away in first gear and nothing could stand in his path. He was also notably interested in these issues. He had been involved in the campaign to oppose the building of the Playhouse and the extension of the Ashmolean in order to preserve Beaumont Street. He would also, of course, go on to pass the Civic Amenities Act at the end of to propose as a private member's bill the Civic Amenities Act of the end of the 1960s, which sets up all those conservation areas. So he's an important figure. In March 1955, Sandys went to Oxford to discuss the city's draft plans and the absence of any discussion of traffic within them. He arrived the night before the annual boat race, dining with the Vice-Chancellor that evening and meeting the City Council next day. A television was specially installed in the Mayor's parlour in the Town Hall to enable those in these discussions to break off for the duration of the race. That Cambridge won was perhaps an ominous omen, for Sandys came away disappointed by his meeting with the City Council, writing to the Mayor that he was unwilling to approve the Oxford Development Plan unless something was done about the High Street. This is, of course, he wrote, not primarily a traffic problem. It is the question of preserving a priceless heritage of culture and beauty. That everyone could agree with this principle is noteworthy. Oxford, in that way, is another illustration of the intertwining of modernism and conservationism that writers like Miles Glendinning have observed. But more important than that general truth was the fact that no one could agree on how best to achieve the minister's goal of preserving Oxford. Not only were there at least 3 and up to 15, by one count, rival plans to consider, people would come up with endless different ideas, including at one stage a tunnel under the meadow. The key players were also profoundly split. Both the City Council and the University, which had at that point in the 1950s 12 seats as of right on the City Council, were divided within and between themselves. The city planning officer and the city engineer were at loggerheads. The council committee responsible for planning was unable, as it admitted, to agree on a solution. In the council itself, one vote proposing a road through Christchurch Meadow produced a vote of 29 in favour and 29 against. As new proposals were put forward, views changed swiftly, with the opposition Labour group opposing Sharp's plans in 1948 and then enthusiastically endorsing them in 1955. Decisions were made and then overturned with alarming rapidity. Within the university, too, opinions were desperately riven. The undergraduate newspaper, Charwell, observed in October 1955 that 10 colleges were in favour of a road across the meadow, while 15 were utterly opposed. But even this was an oversimplification. Colleges, observed the Evening Standard, are cleft into factions, each of which sees cloven hooves beneath the other's gown. Despite the best efforts of the Vice-Chancellor, the university's governing hebdomadal council had to agree to disagree. Meanwhile, Congregation, the assembly of all the academics in Oxford, voted first against a road in Christchurch Meadow, and then a week later in favour of it, at least in extremis. In the process, as the historian Robert Blake, a student of Christchurch and then later, of course, Provost of Queen's, in the process, as Robert Blake noted, old friends nearly came to blows and distinguished academics were reduced to trading insults in the street. And there's a wonderful description of precisely that going on outside the King's Arms after the meeting of Congregation had concluded. Not least of the problems in agreeing a solution to Oxford's traffic was the way in which it attracted alternative schemes. The economist Roy Harrod, a student of Christ Church, projected, as I've mentioned, a tunnel under the meadow, writing to the Times, broadcasting about it on the BBC, and lobbying Sands, who was, as he repeatedly mentioned in every intervention, an old friend of mine. Sands himself also tried to float a different approach, visiting Oxford again for a private meeting and persuading the leaders of the council to spare Christchurch Meadows, but instead run two new roads to the north and south of the city, one way to the south and one off Headington Hill through the parks and down, in the process demolishing dozens of houses to the south and one much loved pub to the north, the Lamb and Flag. The road would have come out exactly in the middle of these buildings where the Lamb and Flag now stands. The northern route, however, was very quickly squashed. St Giles, of course, was partly owned by and certainly seen as the possession of St John's, Oxford's richer college, and also lay close to wealthy North Oxford. It was this new idea which split the Conservative Party in the city, with the Conservative Party of North Oxford, led by a former bursar of St John's, as it happens, to reject road building in Oxford, even as the leaders of the city's Conservatives voted Sands' plan through. It was this proposal, the proposal for a road through the parks and the Lamb and Flag, that changed the votes of the university, many of whom clearly came to prefer a meadow road to one that spoiled St Giles, and, of course, as they kept arguing, ruined experimental work in the science area. Above all, the debate about the road was shaped and people's votes were altered by the Vice-Chancellor of Oxford, who was also Warden of New College. Now, Alex Smith was, like Sands, a man conspicuously committed to the improvement and preservation of Oxford's architectural amenities. He had chaired the campaign to reface Oxford stones. He had been responsible for commissioning the Epstein statue of Lazarus in New College Chapel. He'd also attempted to return New College to a previously Gothic form, with the window of what was the old library, one window being returned to Gothic form before his fellows stopped him doing any more. As part of his campaign to preserve and enhance Oxford, he was agitating not just for a road which would run and take traffic out of High Street. He was arguing for a solution which would exclude all traffic from High Street completely. Now, Smith, as Hugh Trevor Roper maliciously observed, was, I quote, like all who arrive at executive eminence in our universities, a past master of intrigue. His enemies believed that he cheated and swindled their words to get his way. Even his admirers admitted that he was shameless in a fight. It was Smith, as Vice-Chancellor, who had dined with Sands on the minister's fateful visit to the city. He who had attempted to square the university behind a road in the meadow through his chairmanship of Hebdomadal Council. And it was indeed his plan to close High Street to traffic that the minister suggested in November 1955. But his new proposal only made matters worse, for the shopkeepers of Oxford, who had initially favoured a relief road, were horrified at the threat to passing trade that the pedestrianisation of High Street seemed to present. So too, the local Labour Party, initially in favour of building a road through the meadow in 1955, came to fear that the closure of Magdalen Bridge would mean cutting Oxford in two, leaving their constituents in Cowley unable to obtain access to services in the heart of the city. So they switched votes as a result. The debate thus rumbled on for months, provoking much further fury and a 10-day public inquiry. On the 27th of July 1956, the issue actually reached the Cabinet. Indeed, it was recalled by one member of the Conservative government in the 1950s as the only time that any issue of higher education was discussed in Cabinet. Of its 18 members, of the Cabinet's 18 members, more than half had attended Oxford, and no less than a third had been to Christ Church. although legend was later to claim that the cabinet agenda that day read 1. Oxford roads, 2. Seizure of the Suez Canal, the government's sense of priorities is revealed by the fact that the Oxford roads was the 5th item discussed, after the Baghdad Pact, but before local government reorganisation or economic statistics. Sands in that cabinet meeting was forthright in presenting his case. Traffic, he declared, is ruining Oxford. The only solution, he maintained, was some form of relief road, either to the north or the south of the city, and as the university thought the former, the northern road worse than the latter, he recommended a version of Sharp's Merton Mall. Anthony Eden, who had been at Christchurch, was, it seems, doubtful about this. The notes of the cabinet secretary reveal that he thought that Cowley should instead be developed as a separate city. Can't we seal off the old city? He went on to inquire. But the result of these deliberations was a compromise as the cabinet secretary's notes show, that was approved with regret. Merton Mall would be built, Magdalen Bridge would be shut. Despite the shocking outcry that Sands predicted, the high street would be closed to traffic and a road run through Christchurch Meadow. In a masterstroke of misjudgment, the government had agreed on the solution designed to cause the most outrage to the widest range of people. The author of the scheme, Thomas Sharp, was of course predictably pleased. Thank God, he said, for someone with sense and courage. The Architect and Building News, the Architect's Journal, Autocar, and other specialist publications also welcomed Sands' sound judgment on the matter, as the Architect's Journal put it. The Vice-Chancellor and various vocal advocates of the scheme were also presumably content. But the closure of the High Street was simply unconscionable for most city councillors, whilst the road through the meadow remained unacceptable to a majority of university opinion. Worse still, the minister himself was now widely suspected of duplicity. Even the timing of this decision seemed dubious. It is no accident, wrote Robert Blake in The Spectator, that this announcement has appeared right in the middle of the Suez crisis. I cannot believe that Mr. Sands would have got away with it if the cabinet had been less preoccupied by far greater matters. The concatenation of these events, one of global significance, the other of apparently more Lilliputian dimensions, proved irresistible for satirists like the writer in The Times, who described an appeal made to the UN Security Council, and I quote, to take urgent action to remove the threat to peace, culture and human rights contained in the unprovoked seizure of Christchurch Meadow by the British Minister of Housing and Local Government. In truth, however, powerful figures were attempting to mobilise higher powers. Christchurch instructed lawyers and began to serve a writ against Sands. Churchill's scientific advisor, Lord Cherwell, who had lived in Christchurch since 1922 and whose windows actually overlooked the proposed new road, agitated for a royal commission. William Beveridge provoked a 5-hour debate in the House of Lords, one that attracted speakers including Clement Attlee, Lord Halifax and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and one which went on so long that it risked making the peers late for their dinner, something, as the Oxford Mail put it, that happens on only the most exceptional occasions. So it was that the government backed down. The result was a further inquiry, further recommendations, yet further outrage which occasioned more of the same. Multiple proposals would be made, accepted, and then rejected until in 1978, Labour's Environment Secretary Peter Shaw finally killed off the plan for a road through Christchurch Meadow for good. 21 years before that, in February 1957, Robert Blake observed again in The Spectator that the Oxford Roads question has by now made most observers slightly giddy. And if that was true then, I fear I might have made you giddy again now. In any event, it would not serve much useful purpose to trace this battle any further on in time, much less to pursue it all the way to 1978. Instead, what I want to do now is to try and draw out the meaning of the story I've tried to tell you, and to relate it to the wider question of architecture and town planning in Oxford that I began with. It seems to me the story of Oxford's roads raises 3 issues. In the first place, it tells us something about tactics. The tactics used by those involved in this debate are highly revealing. They exemplify the ways in which politicians like Sand sought to avoid public involvement, whilst campaigners and planners hoped to stimulate it. After all, it was the minister who attempted to manage this problem through private meetings and who wrote at the very beginning of the process of his efforts, I quote, to avoid the necessity for bringing in outside inquiries. This debate also illuminates the multiple ways that were open to different people who wished to shape the urban fabric around them, and the ways in which the people of Oxford took advantage of those opportunities. From public meetings and letters in the newspapers, to the consultations carried out by the council, to the surveys carried out by the Oxford Preservation Trust, to the more private access granted to members of the social and cultural elite. This was a moment, but more than a moment, in which a variety of actors could and did contribute to planning policy. And that has remained the case in Oxford. And indeed, the legacy of this debate is, in fact, that Oxford has two very vibrant campaigning organisations seeking to preserve and enhance the amenities of the city, because it was over the Christchurch Meadow road, of course, that Oxford Preservation Trust split, with those in favour of the road through the meadow remaining in the trust and those opposed to it going and setting up the civic society. The second thing I think this story tells us is something important about the terms of the debate. All of those people in the 1950s, and since, I think, accepted a common frame of reference. All, naturally enough, believed themselves to be acting in the best interests of Oxford, and all of them are very clear about that, as we all still are now. All, somewhat inevitably, argued that they were seeking to preserve the beauties of an ancient and historic city. More interestingly, though, all the participants claimed that their position was not merely preservationist. They also claimed that theirs was the one that best reflected the realities of modern life. Their opponents, by contrast, they sought to depict as reactionaries, unable to comprehend the challenges of the modern day. Those who wished to close Magdalen Bridge were attacked by Labour councillors for trying to create a, this is rather wonderful, Vatican City in Oxford, a National Trust sanctuary for dons. Advocates of a road through the meadow were condemned for wanting to achieve the re-Gothicising of Oxford. Writing privately, Hugh Trevor Roper joked that the Vice-Chancellor, Alex Smith, hoped to ensure that, and I quote, the High Street, newly cobbled and grassed, should accommodate only maypoles and Morris dancers and barefooted monks singing vespers through the nose. Writing publicly, the warden of Merton College, in fact, the warden who commissioned the house that Bill Bryson would go on to hate so much, their warden slammed Smith for wanting to, and I quote, ride his hobby horse round the re-medievalised Oxford of his dreams. Yet, as the Vice-Chancellor's allies asserted, the plan Alex Smith was proposing was in fact ultra-modern, recommended by the latest authorities on the subject. In closing High Street and diverting the traffic elsewhere, wrote the rector of Lincoln College, Oxford would be getting ahead of the game, providing, quote, something that every city will be driven before long to try somehow to secure. Oxford is not a museum, observed the Lord Mayor in January 1956. I think of it as a town and not a tomb. Everyone could agree with that, even if they could not agree what that meant in practice. Above all, thirdly, I think what this project, like the other buildings I've talked about earlier, does, is to tell us something about what's at stake in Oxford, and the ceaseless debate that we are all participating in about how best to preserve what's good and to add what's good as well. And both those questions can cause problems, as they did in the debate over Christchurch Meadow. Indeed, looking at Oxford's hated buildings, it's clear from this example that much of the worst architecture in Oxford is the product of people seeking to avoid unpleasant questions or debate. When the architect Lionel Esher was asked to account for this disastrously drab addition to Broad Street for Exeter College, Esher, who was by no means a bad architect, simply observed that Oxford gave me stage fright. Similar impulses led to the 60s excrescence at Merton Street, which was deliberately designed to be unobtrusive, with the hope that nobody would really notice it was there. And the same is true of dozens of offensively self-effacing structures across this city to this day. Deliberately ignoring the context, however, often produces a still worse result. The city can cope with a lot. In its history, there have been, as I've suggested, numerous changes of style, of material, of the means of construction, but scale, it seems to me, remains all important. The reason that no one has ever had a good word to say about this, New College's Sacher building, is not that its fabric or even its facade are inherently offensive. I mean, actually, as a building, I'm rather fond of it. It's rather that it doesn't seem to belong in Long Wall Street at all. And if we contrast its scale with the scale of the vernacular buildings next to it, you see just how disastrously inappropriate it actually is. The same would have been true of another failed project, the 25-story zoology tower proposed for the parks in 1962. It was suggested the Vice-Chancellor, this time Maurice Bowrer, intended to bring a touch of San Gimignano to the parks. It was sensibly resolved that this was something the city could do well without. And as the recent controversy over the university's graduate accommodation at Castle Mill in Jericho suggests, the need to temper boldness with sensitivity to scale remains an issue of real importance for Oxford. It's not just that this is a numbingly dull development, defended oxymoronically by its architects as a, and I quote, timeless contemporary design, whatever that means. It's also that its opponents, I think, rightly believe it to be much, much too big. Undoubtedly, Ruskin would have found its predominating presence on Port Meadow insupportable, unless, of course, as I say, he preferred it to the view of Jericho that it now obliterates. Still in Jericho, the Blavatnik School of Government, opposite the University Press, raises similar questions about ambition and massing. There can be no doubt that this is bold, though the architect's familiar cliche that political transparency is best expressed through architectural transparency is just a little bit wearisome. That's exactly what they said. I mean, the point is that it is not always transparent, and it is literally transparent rather than figuratively, but never mind. The big issue is with its size. For critics, its mass is simply too great, and the somewhat spurious claims that its form is inspired by the curved facades of the Sheldonian do not compensate for its impact on the surrounding buildings. Its admirers, of course, naturally disagree with that. But I think the point is that modern building can work when it's attentive to scale as well as to style. Indeed, style is arguably much less important than questions of scale. And here are two very recent examples that I think provide a good evidence of that. The Siu Snyangyam Tower and Sukhum Navapaun Gate at Harris Manchester College are simply designed to be fun. The soft bridge at St Anthony's by Zaha Hadid is again a kind of jeu d'esprit. In many ways, in fact, they're not unlike the Bridge of Sighs at Hertford, which is a silly bit of architecture, if we're honest. It's whimsical. They're meant to be statement buildings, drawing attention to buildings that don't have very distinguished architecture otherwise. This was something very clearly a decision made at Hertford, which believed itself at the end of the 19th century still to be undistinguished architecturally. The same is true here. They're statement buildings. They're both buildings that some people really dislike. But I think what they do is illustrate that scale can work in Oxford. This is not, though, a story of unremitting continuity, of course, a perpetual battle between those who oppose change on all counts and those who wish to bring it about at all costs. I think that's the critical lesson of the debate about the roads. All of them accepted the need for change. They just differed about what that change actually was. And the differences between Hertford's Bridge and St Anthony's makes that plain. Hertford built its Bridge of Sighs almost at the very last moment the centre of Oxford was open for radical change. In the last decade, the new college, the new developments at St John's in 2010 and Pembroke of 2013 may yet be the last really significant developments in the ancient city centre that they sought to preserve in the 1950s. For much of the city, all that's left is the sort of infilling and patching together that can be seen at St Antony's or in the new lecture theatres that have been squeezed into Corpus, St Edmund Hall and Lincoln. And I think even the massive extension of Jesus fits within that. Yet, although the city centre is full, the university continues to grow, hence the development of the old Radcliffe Infirmary site, hence the many new buildings for the medical school, hence the visual incursions on Port Meadow, hence this, which is what the university fondly hopes they will build in South Parks Road, with massive new construction. We have been, and as long as the economy doesn't collapse completely, we continue to be in a period of quite remarkable architectural expansionism, fueled by the generosity of benefactors like Schwartzman in the New Humanities Building, fueled by the capacity of universities to borrow money at very low rates, fueled too by the willingness of financial instruments like Legal and General to invest billions of pounds in university real estate. The question remains for Oxford, the same question that people were seeking to address in the 1950s. Where is all this growth to go? What has to be lost for the university and its colleges to continue on this path? And not just the university and colleges. As the city seeks to grow, as the city seeks to solve the housing crisis, the questions are present still there too. The battles of the future, it seems to me, look less about individual buildings in some respects, and more about the nature of the city itself. But in a sense, even that isn't new. Oxford's hated buildings and the failed project of the road through the building, the road through the meadow, suggests that there is an eternal question that we have to address as the citizens of Oxford. How do we preserve the best of the old? How do we replace and enhance with the best of the new? And so in 100 years' time, it will be fascinating to see, as people review what are the hated buildings, how many of them are still hated, and whether or not they've solved the problem that has dogged Oxford ever since the university took it over all those years ago. Thank you very much.